block you for a moment, Tim, but I'll be out of your way in a minute. Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School. I want to welcome you all to a truly extraordinary evening. This is the second year in the partnership between the Council of Women World Leaders and the Kennedy School. You may remember we had a fascinating discussion last year and an equally fascinating panel. This year we are fortunate to double the treasure. We have members of the Interaction Council, which includes some very distinguished presidents and prime ministers, and I will let Judy Woodruff introduce them in just a minute. But I just want to say a word about how pleased I am about the partnership that we have developed with the Council of Women World Leaders, chaired by President Vigdis of Iceland and co-chaired or vice-chaired by Laura Liswood. It has been something which I think has been a way for our students who are being trained to be public leaders to see that women can be extremely effective public leaders. And since nearly half our students are women, and we expect them to be leaders in the future, this is a partnership which we intend to further. So we are delighted to have this second annual occasion in which the Council has held its meetings here. We look forward to many others. We're also delighted to welcome members of the Interaction Council, who will be holding their experts group on reform of international monetary affairs here at the Kennedy School tomorrow. And Sir Malcolm Fraser has been very instrumental in putting this together. To introduce our panel tonight, but even more important, to lead the questioning, we have somebody who is also coming back for a second year, extremely talented at this, and that's Judy Woodruff. Any of you who have a television set know Judy Woodruff, but you may not know that she was born in Oklahoma, went to Duke University, started her television career in Atlanta, became a White House correspondent for NBC, then spent a decade as a crucial figure at the public broadcasting system on several important shows, and then moved to CNN, where she is an anchor, co-anchor, and also of their major events, always present. And Judy, for her coverage, received the 1997 Emmy Award for the way she handled the Atlanta Olympics. So we're delighted to welcome back Judy Woodruff. I will now turn it over to you, Judy.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Joe Nye, first of all. To you, it is an honor for me to serve on the distinguished Board of Advisors of the Council of Current and Former Women World Leaders. It is a great honor for me to participate in this forum, in this summit, for the second year in a row. And I want to pay a special tribute to you, to two people, to Dean Joe Nye for his role in supporting the creation of the Council, which he's just described, and to someone sitting on the front row, Laura Liswood, who has been a constant nurturer, if you will, of this Council in her role as its vice chair. I will confess to you that as a journalist, I'm accustomed to being regarded with suspicion and even held in contempt. So it is a great honor for me to be in the company for just a few moments today of some people who I hold in such tremendous esteem. I also want to point out that before I introduce the members of this extraordinarily distinguished panel, I want to recognize some other members of the Council of Women World Leaders who happen to be in the audience with us tonight. First of all, Her Excellency Kazimiera Prunskienė, former Prime Minister of Lithuania. the Right Honorable Pamela Gordon, former Premier of Bermuda. The Honorable Dame Eugenia Charles, former Prime Minister of Dominica. And I believe the Honorable Maria Liberia Peters, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands Antilles. I'm not sure if she's here. We are so very fortunate to have with us such a rare coming together of President and former heads of state. I would just add that this forum today represents a collaboration between the Interaction Council, an organization made up of former presidents and prime ministers of a number of important countries, and of the Council of Women World Leaders, a collaboration that was begun several years ago between these two high-level groups and their members. So we want to extend once again our appreciation to the Interaction Council. But now to introduce the people who are the main, the stars of this evening, if you will. To my right, to your left, first of all, Madam Kim Campbell. She was Prime Minister of Canada in 1993. Kim Campbell. Next to her, Madam Vigdis Finnbogadottir, President of Iceland from 1980 to 1996. And to her left, Minister Malcolm Fraser, Prime Minister of Australia from 1975 to 1983. To my immediate right, Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany from 1974 to 1982. To my left, Minister Ruud Lubbers, Prime Minister of the Netherlands from 1982 to 1994. And to his left, Madam Jennifer Smith, Premier of Bermuda since November 1998. And finally, Hanna Suchotka, Prime Minister of Poland from 1992 to 1993. The title of our session this evening is Challenges of the 21st Century, Priorities for Nations and Their Leaders. I think there's so much that's already been said about the next century and the next millennium, if you will. We all probably get a little tired of over-anticipating, but setting that aside, I do think that we want to begin by asking each one of our distinguished panelists how they summarize the challenges, the priorities facing their country and indeed the world as we do go into the 21st century. What is different about the priorities we face in the near future from what we have seen in previous decades? Or are they different? Are they the same? And I'd like to begin with Malcolm Fraser. Prime Minister Fraser.
Thank you very much. Many of the challenges in the next century are going to be similar. We haven't really come to grips with matters like the environment, with population. Some places, some countries have, but as a world, we certainly haven't. I think also life is made more difficult because of the modern practice of polling. I don't want to be critical of current leaders, but I believe too many of them look at the polls first and try and decide what they should do second. So if you could abolish polling, leaders would then have to rely on something else. Leaders need a capacity for judgment and instinct. There's only one purpose for a poll: to tell them whether their public is already with them or whether they have a massive job in persuading them that what they think now is wrong and that they've got to do something else. That's probably enough to start with.
But in terms of issues, population, environment?
For global issues, there are some other very particular issues which primarily concern two major states. The real dangers, I believe, will come in the relationship between the United States and China. And as you know, the capacity of these two major states to manage their relationship through the next century, especially over issues such as Taiwan, I think is going to be absolutely critical. I mean, if there was an issue that could trigger war, it would be Taiwan, and then it would be between China and America. And for an Australia living in the south of Southeast Asia, and all the countries of East Asia, a conflict over that issue, you know, we believe is totally unnecessary, but also it's possible.
Minister Suhotka, would you buy into that line of reasoning that it's population and environment, in addition to that, you have to worry about the United States and China?
You know, when I think, because you started with different questions concerning our vision and the distinction and difference now and 10 years ago, so I try to thought on the problem, because it is one of the biggest problems at the moment. Because, you know, always when we discuss and when we try to see something in the future, not in the near future, but in the farther future, I see how weak we are. And that is really very difficult to be a prophet for the future. You know, I remember that 10 years ago, it was for me impossible to think that I'll be back in politics, or that I'll be played such a important political role, because it was rather sure for us living in Poland that Berlin Wall will be forever, that world divided into two blocks will be forever, and that will be forever in one of the blocks under Soviet dominations. And now 10 years term changed everything. So it's really very difficult to say and to make a vision for next 100 years, because we are unable to say what could happen in 10 years term. And of course, it happens also the problem of environmental and population. Because, for example, 10 years ago in Poland, we discussed on environmental problems, but they were real problems. At the moment, they are, but we try to solve the problems. And now we can solve the problem being involved in different international programs, having a possibility to have money from European Union and other international organizations. 10 years ago, it was completely impossible. So, taking it into account, I should be really a very, very optimistic. But on the other side, when I see such a danger and really a very tragic situation like war in Kosovo, I always remember what was in history the consequences of the war in the Balkan. And from this point of view, I am much more pessimistic, but I think that maybe will be, I am sure that will be possible to avoid the consequences of war in the Balkan.
Well, we'll be talking, I know, some more about that in a moment. Minister Kim Campbell, what do you see that the leaders of today and the leaders in the next decades will be facing?
Well, let me approach it from a slightly different angle, because I agree with Hannah. I mean, we're all just astonished at what has happened in the world. My first career, I was a Soviet specialist, and I've certainly been rendered a historian by the events of the last couple of decades. And so we know that one of the constants is going to be change, and the real challenge for us is to figure out what is really new and what just seems to be new. But something else I think we have to think of is that, by definition, leaders tend to be middle-aged people. And we are living in a period of time where some of the major rifts in societies are generational. A study done of Canadian attitudes showed that, in fact, the differences in attitudes in Canada are not regional, but they really are generational. And I think particularly of the enormous gap that exists now between many of the people in the world who are making key decisions and the technological competence and the outlook and the way of looking, the way of regarding technology and everything that is characteristic of so many young people today. That I think the real challenge for leaders is to know themselves, to question their assumptions, to be able to place themselves generationally in terms of place and say, what is it about who I am that makes me ignorant about things I need to know about to be a wise leader. What do I need to know about the experience of young people today? It's not just that they're young and in the thrall of their hormones. They are living in a totally different universe. What's the implication of that for public policy? Who are the people in my country? They're not necessarily the same ethnic mix they were when I was growing up. What are the implications of that? What is the mindset of people in countries like China? And I don't want to take Helmut Schmidt's fire, because I know he is particularly interested in one aspect of that particular question. So I think that capacity to stop taking ourselves and our position for granted and begin to look beyond our own reality is urgent. It's always been urgent, and particularly same thing with respect to gender. That one has to question all of the old verities, and I think that is a challenge that faces a leader today who wants to be wise.
Minister Lubers, could it be that the leaders, today's leaders, are frankly not very well equipped to handle what's coming in the decades ahead, either by virtue of the age discrepancy that Minister Campbell mentioned, because the issues are too complicated? What? I mean, what would you say?
I would say that leadership is basically always, all times, about the capacity to convince people to change. Always changes are needed, new situations. So this is the permanent factor. But more precisely answering your question, I think there are a few differences today. First of all, what are leaders? In the title here, we are talking about nations and their leaders. Of course, nations are very important. I was in office quite a period, so I cannot less than agree. But leadership in all other sort of institutions, family, civil society institutions, is as important. Civil society is more important than in the past, because if we have to cope with problems in a world in which there are more and more global problems and transboundary problems, it's clear that it is more difficult, and then I answer your question, for politicians, leaders in a nation to achieve. Just more difficult. Just because of that phenomenon that countries, nations, are not any longer alone and not any longer there to solve conflicts between nations, but try to solve problems together. Last remark then is, what are the priorities? That was your first question.
Right.
I would think in such a world which is developing today, where people are more and more connected all over the globe, we need to see the basics. And the basics I find is that people want a just, sustainable, and participatory society. These are really the three basic things. Just is about justice, human rights, and fairness. Sustainable is to take into account the generations to come, if you like your environmental aspect. The third, participatory, is that each and every single human being has to be empowered to participate in society, in work, in activities. Those are the three fundamentals. And finally, but that will be your next part, I think, the special role of women in this challenge.
And we can get to that. I want to bring President Vigdis in Bagadat at this point, because we started out talking about priorities. We're also bringing up the things that make it more difficult for leaders to address those priorities. From your perspective, what are the toughest challenges facing the leaders of the next decades?
I think indeed that the leaders of the world do not see enough to the young people, do not look enough at the young people. I'm very much concerned about young people. We know that in about 10 years, 15 years' time, more than half of humankind will be less than 20 years old. And when we think of youth, we constantly think of education, to give them education. But we need to extend that thought a little bit further. This youth that is being brought up in the so-called third world doesn't have access to education. And this access is very much worrying me. We know that the key to the 21st century is education. is to know about, is to be technically equipped. And at the same time, we know that 50% of those who live on Earth do not have access to computers, and so they are alienated from that. So I am very much afraid of the fact that our technological society is indeed widening the gap between the South and the North, and between the rich and the poor.
Chancellor Schmidt, education, is that the most important issue facing nations in the coming decades? Is it a combination of things that we've been talking about?
Well, education may be a very important issue in some countries, not necessarily in Holland or in Germany or in Australia, although there is quite room for improvements in Holland or in Germany or in Australia. No, the greatest problem of this next century is the overpopulation of this globe. At the beginning of the 20th century, 99 years ago, we were just 1.6 billion people. Right now we are beyond 6 billion. And in 30, 40 years' time, we'll be beyond 9 billion people. 1999 years ago, there was so much space for every individual living on this globe. Today, the space has shrunk to 3% of what it was 2,000 years ago. And it will shrink further. And this will lead to wars in Asia, in Africa, maybe in Latin America, other places. And the most important thing is to dampen this population explosion. And this, in a way, leads me to, and not for the first time in my life, to say, one of the most important things in order to dampen the population explosion is family planning, and the most important thing to bring family planning about is giving education to girls, enhancing the status of women, and making contraceptives available to every woman. And I don't say this in order to please women. I say this in order to make understandable that there is a way to dampen the population explosion. And if it goes on, like in our century, then the greenhouse effect will become true. And all of us will be happy then not to live in Bangladesh, for instance, at sea level, because the oceans will rise. The global temperature this century has increased. That is what the scientific people guess, between 1/3 of a centigrade and 2/3 of a centigrade. The predictions for the next century are between 1.5 additional centigrade at the minimum and 3.5 additional centigrades at a maximum. Already 2.5 would lead to catastrophes in many parts of the world. It's unclear how much human action is responsible and how much the changes of climate by nature is responsible. We have been living in ice ages in my country, last time about 20,000 years ago, but some hundreds of thousands years ago we had elephants on our country. There have been changes of climate which were not due to human action. There may be such changes also in the future. But in the near future, let us say the next 100 years, human action will be most important, meaning the more people who want to cook their meals, to heat their homes in wintertime, to light their homes in the evening, to drive motor cars, to fly in airplanes, the more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases will be emitted into the atmosphere, and the more likely becomes the greenhouse effect. Also, from that ecological point of view, the dampening of the population explosion is the most important problem of the next century.
Well, Premier Jennifer Smith, our newest leader, are the leaders of the nations today, are they prepared to deal with, whether it's population, whether it's education, these other issues? how much does it matter what skills these leaders have in these different countries?
Well, first of all, I think I have to begin by explaining where my country is and what it is. We are 22 square miles, and we are the second most isolated island in the world next to St. Helena. While we do have a very large population, we have had zero population growth for a number of years. And I certainly would never argue with any of these world leaders about what the major problem is. But I do want to agree with President Vigdis that I see our major problem, that looking at the next millennium, having come out of the Industrial Revolution and having understood that education was the means to get away from the class system, that what we now have to recognize, if we don't come to grips with exactly the problem that President Vigdis talked about, and that is the inaccessibility of many families to technology. If we don't see that there is a computer in every home, then we'll be creating another problem, another situation that will be equal to the class situation, that will lead to the kinds of anger and the kinds of violence that has inhabited cities for some time, particularly in America, when you have alienated and angry people because they are not participating in the mainstream economy. So what I see as my major problem as the leader of my country, yes, education is a problem. Yes, we want to keep population down. However, we need to ensure that as we approach the next millennium, we do not consciously leave families out by not ensuring that they have access to technology, because that is the new fundamental.
Prime Minister Fraser, are we looking at in the world today, are we inevitably facing a gap between the rich and the poor? We've addressed it here with education, we've addressed it with regard to population, that is going to be very, very difficult for leaders both of the haves and the have-nots.
Well, in the last 15 years, we've created a world financial system in which the rich have got richer and the poor have got poorer. And that's true within countries and between countries. In America and Australia, the rich-poor gap is bigger than it was. But the difference between America and Australia and sub-Saharan Africa or countries in the Caribbean is larger than it was. And one of the reasons for this is because major Western nations, the wealthy nations in the world, have not, in my view, exhibited a sense of responsibility about their role in the world. In the years after the World War, I think many people showed a very real sense of responsibility. The Marshall Plan and all sorts of things were done to help war-ravaged nations rebuild. Donor nations were much more generous to the third world. For the last 15 years, English-speaking countries in particular have cut back, and cut back. I'm involved with an aid organization. I'm involved with emergency organization. But governments have got meaner year by year by year. There are very few exceptions to that. Nordic countries are an exception. There are a very small handful of countries that have continued to be very generous. But most countries are not. And incidentally, I think they misjudge their own people, because when we have an appeal from the general public are generous, but governments are not. So I think there's a lack of sense of responsibility from major states, from wealthy states, in helping some of the poorer nations tackle these countries and enabling them to overcome the gap. I agree absolutely. You know, modern technology, computers in schools, these sorts of things are going to increase the gap in coming years, and there's something quite urgent is done about it for many, many countries.
Is the will going to be there, Minister? I want to ask both Minister Campbell and...
Well, I think that's a crucial question, if the will is going to be there, because I think when we talk about education, it's all very well to talk about technology, and I agree with you, the concern about creating a haves and have-not world. But we are seeing an interesting phenomenon, an increase in democratization. Within democracies, an increasing desire of people to have their say, an increasing distrust of elites, an increasing dissemination of power. And at the same time, the problems that we face are ones that are long-term problems. So how do we educate people to be citizens in the 21st century, to really understand the implications of their democratic decision-making? Because most of the key issues are going to be decided by the modern industrial democracies, Canada, the United States, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. These are the countries whose decisions, we're the ones that are creating the hole in the ozone, we're the ones that are creating the pollution. And so our citizens have to be citizens of the world, and are we educating them to really understand? And I think the challenge of democratic leadership, you know, we often hear the shibboleth that political leaders will not think long term, that they're only concerned about getting reelected. And I suppose to some degree that's true, but I've known many people in public life who have been visionary leaders. I once had somebody who worked for me as an assistant who concluded that Canada had politicians and public servants better than they deserve, but that the electorate was corrupt. Now, that was a particularly cynical view, but I think it's a serious issue. How do we create the sense of urgency among people to know what decisions have to be made, as opposed to being concerned about short-term gain? And I don't have an easy answer to that. I mean, I think that is the challenge to leadership, is to mobilize people to understand. I mean, it's easy to talk about World War II and what wonderful things happened, but remember, the United States did not go into World War II until it was bombed. Now, Canada and Australia were already there, but, you know, it takes a lot to shake Americans up. Now, you know, I'm not suggesting anything quite that drastic, but there are worse things happening than Pearl Harbor up there. And how do we make people connect that to their own lives and the futures, not even just of their children, of themselves? We're all going to live to be a zillion. I mean, do you want to live, you know, in an era of global warming at 120? I think it's something we have to think about.
Minister Suhotka, do you want to weigh in here?
You know, I think that we are much more able today put the questions than answer the questions. And of course, I am only able to put the many questions. For example, problem concerning the leadership. I observe the situation that at the moment in contemporary world, we can observe the increasing erosion of leaders, of leadership authority. And the question arises, where is the basis, where is the reason why we have such a situation where leadership is not so important as it was, for example, 50 years ago? I think that one of the reasons is the growing role of TV and the role played by such very important persons. They are, for example, the talk shows hosts. They, of course, are
You mean you have those in Poland as well?
Yes, of course, you know. We have a very important person, and they play a very important role. And sometimes, when I discuss with publics in my constituency, I have to give counter-argumentations to the argumentations presented by such leaders in TV discussions. So I think that is really very important. You never know how important role you played maybe, because you really, at the moment, in the end of 20th century, you have these souls in your hands. Yeah. And we are much weaker because we are in hands of TV hosts, because when we are not invited to be present in such a TV programs and discussion, we are absent on political stage. So here's a very important role. We have to cooperate together and to be more visible, because you are visible, and politicians at the moment are not so visible as they would like to be visible.
How do you say crossfire in Polish?
Crossfire in Polish, you know.
I'm teasing.
Krzyżowe pytania.
What did you say?
What was it in Polish? Say it again.
Krzyżowe pytania.
Of course.
Yes, of course. So, Minister Lubers, we've talked about, I mean, there are a lot of things that we're talking about, and we're already running out of time. There's so many questions I have. We've identified television, we've identified polls as two obstacles to good leadership, enlightened leadership. Do you believe, and I think this is part of the question that I posed to you before, that given these problems that we're talking about here this evening, and given this political climate that the democracies exist in, are leaders going to be in a position to address these problems? Is it going to take special qualities, special skills on the part of the leaders of the 21st century that we don't have in evidence right now?
It's difficult. One must be fair. I agree with you. We live in a period of time where there is a lot of short-term thinking. It's a lot about the economy, money tomorrow, not over 10 years, but today. We have the media, sound bites. The shorter the better. The politicians fit in. They're only on the screen when they play with it. I mean, when they are part of the play. So this is a real handicap. And it's a challenge for a leader who has to give hope and a perspective for the future to go beyond that. So you're right, it's very difficult. That's objectively speaking, more difficult than in the past. Secondly, I'm convinced that it's not only a question of the quality of leaders. We have also the problem that we fought for decades that our politicians would solve everything. And that is nonsense. It's impossible. We overrate the capacity of politicians to solve everything. We politicians, I say we politicians still, should realize that really to achieve something, you need people beyond yourself, leaders in the society, leaders of civil institutions, leaders of non-profit organizations. This is not a naive fairy tale story. Of course, those people cannot handle the Kosovo crisis. But if it is about the fundamentals, how to improve quality of life, how to find a way out in the birth control, how to find a way out in education and diminish poverty. Leaders, political leaders are important, but they have to join forces with civil society. I'm convinced of that. And only then you can create a perspective of hope and trust. Because believe me, Judy, today people are very cynical and pessimistic. Sometimes they're scared also. They simply don't believe that their leaders and the politicians will achieve. So we can have a nice forum and formulate the things, but it won't help very much. So there is really a danger of a negative spiral. And we should break through this negative spiral by realizing that we are living in a different period in which not only politicians can do the job, politicians who are enslaved, as you say, by the media.
President Vigdis, how do leaders get around this? How do they do their job without worrying about satisfying instant public demand, satisfying the news media? How do they keep a clear head?
Well, leaders are in a terrible competition with capitalism and with the money market and everything that's money. And
what do you mean a competition?
Competition because the market society acquires all that, the attention, takes all the attention. And I agree with Hanna Szuszorska that society has changed so much because it has stopped listening. It's only looking, always looking at pictures, and not listening, and to listen, to create image in your mind, gives you a better understanding of things. So I regret that. But if I had a key, solution key to this, good heavens, I would travel around the world and offer that to everybody. But I think I agree with Minister Lubers, who says that it has to come from the people themselves. It has to come from the grassroots. It has to come to gain the confidence of the people for a leader. And if a leader must know where he is going, he cannot be a man or a woman from day to day. He has to have a vision, and he has to convince his people and the people that are going along with him that he likes them, that he really cares for them. And he's doing that out of care.
Chancellor, go ahead.
I agree with that, but there are a lot of things we used to try and do in the 50s, the 60s, into the middle 70s, which I don't believe the world tries to do today. And one of those was to create the conditions in which third world countries could do better. Now, it's all very well for somebody to get up and say, if they do as I do in Australia or in America, they'll be all right. But there's an area the size of Belgium turned into desert every year in Africa because the only fuel people have, the only fuel they can afford is brushwood. So they cut it down, and when it's all cut down in one area, they go on somewhere else, and they cut it down somewhere else. Now, for years, we could do something about this. And there are some aid agencies trying to plant some trees and do something. But is anyone prepared to put really sufficient funds into this kind of problem in the third world, which in different ways is repeated in many, many different countries? Are they really prepared to put the resources that will give them the basis so that they could break through and carry on themselves? And the response to wealthy countries in the last 15 years in this wonderful market world we live in has been to say, no, we're going to make less resources available than we ever have in the 50 years since the war.
Let me ask Chancellor Schmidt, where do leaders go to find the courage and the space, the patience on the part of their constituents, if you will, to make the hard decisions, to do the things that they know or they believe are right? And I'm speaking in a democratic context.
Well, I'm not so sure whether it all so much does depend on a single individual leader on top of the state or as a Lord Mayor of the city. I'm not so sure that, on the other hand, leadership comes from the grassroots level either. But I think leadership in the main has come so far and will come in the future as well from a number of elites that have developed over time, for instance, in the field of education. If the German universities are by far below the average of the American universities, it is due to the fact that the professorial elite in Germany hasn't really done their job. They haven't really developed leadership in their field. You have an elite in business, for instance. If I look to what the CEOs at investment funds and hedge funds and big banks in America do, I wonder whether they, this banking managerial elite, whether they are really living up to their job. Certainly do they get an enormous salary and bonuses. Otherwise, they give bad examples to the rest of the world. You need leadership also in political affairs, but you don't want single leader. You need a parliament of 400 people or 300 people, depending on the constitution and on the country, and at least 1/2 of them ought to know their job. And on top of that, they ought to have the courage to form their own opinions on specific matters. And on top of that, have the courage to speak up and have the wisdom to come to compromises in the end, because any law that has to, any bill that has to be passed does need a majority. And even inside the majority, you have to compromise. And so you need leadership from all the kinds, whether parliament or universities or high schools or churches, not the grassroots really. They will more or less follow. There's one thing which will not follow. This is the media. I'm on the side of those who criticize television in particular. Television is a bad influence on average onto the young people. Much too much crime, much too much violence, much too many automobile crashes. All the young people, 13 of age, 12 of age, sit longer hours per week in front of this television set than they sit in classrooms and in schools. And they think what their parents tell them is one thing, but the real life they have seen on the screen with their own eyes and heard with their own ears, and this is giving them the ideas of what life is about, violence.
You don't
particularly in the suburbs of the big cities, not only in America, also in my country.
You don't think they watch too much television because they haven't been challenged enough by their leaders, do you? That was meant to be. we want to leave time for questions from the audience, and the clock is ticking, but there are two other areas I want to get to. One, we may be able to dispense with very quickly, and that is the leadership styles of men and women. Is there a difference or not? It is something that we talked about in this forum last year, but perhaps some of our members have something to add today. But I also want to come to you, Jennifer Premier Smith, to ask you, Kosovo. The world has changed. You've all referred to it in the last 10 years. The Berlin Wall came down. We have countries seeking an identity, parts of countries, and we have people seeking an identity that weren't before. Is this an issue that you think is going to take a special talent on the part of leaders to deal with? We know it's not something that's going to be solved quickly. We're watching the United States and the other NATO countries right now caught up in a very, very difficult set of circumstances. But what is it going to take on the part of leaders to think about these new issues and these new strategic issues in a different way, is my question.
Well, I think it's part of what has just been said by Chancellor Smith. At times, when leaders do not seem to understand the problem or do not come to the fore, I believe that the people themselves will come up with creative solutions. I think that just as you said earlier, when you could not foresee the falling of the Berlin Wall, you could not foresee that South Africa so quickly would have become democratic and have gotten online. When leaders cannot see past the problem, often the people, I think, take it into their own hands in various ways to come to a solution. What I did want to say about the problem of making sure that you have the faith of the people. As a newly elected premier in November, the young people in my country were very instrumental in our win. And it was the first time we had ever had a change of government in Bermuda's entire history. And that change happened because we went to the people, and the people put their faith and their trust in us. And I believe when people have faith in their elected officials, when you've earned their trust, then you can get the patience from them while you do the long-term things that need to be done. And we have had that kind of support. Now, I recognize I'm talking in a very small context, but in a country that's never had a change, to have the support of a public who say, we will wait until you are able to make these changes that you have talked about for so long, and we are patient, and we have faith in you, is a very unique thing. And I have faith in the human nature.
Anybody want to pick up on that, or?
Well, I just to say, apropos of the situation in Kosovo, it's very vexing and very perplexing. And when I was in government in several portfolios, I was involved in the same kind of situation in Bosnia. But I would just say one thing apropos of American leadership, because Canada and the United States are certainly very, very close friends. We have the world's largest trading relationship. But one of the things that very much strikes me in looking at American responses to things is that Americans, I think, often tend to forget that they're Americans, and that not everybody in the world is American. They don't think like Americans, they don't have American history, and America sort of tends to expect the rest of the world to respond. And I think sometimes in these difficult issues, the Europeans, who are often criticized, are less eager to jump in simply because they've been there, they've been closer to it. They are maybe a little more jaded about the reality. And I think that, again, that's one of the challenges of understanding your own perspective. And the United States has an extraordinary role to play in the world, as an extraordinary role of leadership. But that means that Americans do have to understand that the rest of the world are not Americans, and what that means to be an American.
But NATO didn't have to go along. I mean, the rest of
No,
NATO
but what
didn't
I'm
have to
saying
go
is that there is a very strong American predisposition to think that every problem has a solution.
But isn't the global society also bringing about, there's an increased need for people
Women
to
are known for
understand
their
other
tolerance of
cultures.
ambiguity, and in that sense, America is truly macho. No ambiguity.
You want to?
Yeah, Hannah first. Hannah, of course, Hannah.
I'd like only to add that because you put the question concerning leadership in case of Kosovo, I think that in Kosovo we have the bad example, negative example of leadership. But when we analyze the behavior of Milosevic, it's a leaders He is real leader, but his behavior has led to negative factors, to war in former Yugoslavia. It's the same case as Gaddafi. Maybe we have to analyze and maybe we have to think why the negative leadership is so strong and positive is not so strong, yes? Being a positive leadership in contemporary world, we have to look for such a big support, and we are maybe sometimes not so clearly recognized, but negative leaderships is really very well recognized, and there are consequences.
I think Kosovo is an example of bad leadership. Explain that shortly, not just today. 10 years ago, we had the end of the Cold War. There was a call for a new mission for NATO. We didn't fulfill that. Afterwards, we thought, let's go on. Then it took 5 years before we developed what's called Partnership for Peace. Partnership for Peace, in essence, was enlargement of NATO together with an intense cooperation with non-NATO members in Central and Eastern Europe to safeguard peace. That was the idea. What we did, in fact, was only enlargement of NATO. We were not very practical and specific in the second line of action. And then you're going to pay a price, of course. Then some people said, maybe we are living in a different world. We have to go on with leadership of the United States in NATO. But at the very same time, we need a special approach working together with Moscow and the European Union. It was said time and again, it was never done. And we Europeans thought, after all, we have a leader in Washington. So if he thinks this is best, it is best. He will achieve. So we cannot make the excuse today that Milosevic is a bad man. Of course, we have a NATO and an organization to defend peace there where there are those type of people. Last point. You cannot say, seriously, I feel committed and responsible for basic human rights, as is the case there today, if you don't take the consequences. If you say, yes, we are very serious about it, but we are not prepared for ground troops, forget the whole thing from the beginning. We have never won a battle with airstrikes only. Every person could know that. It could be useful in advance, but at some point you have to know. So this is really an essential point, I'm being very blunt here now, about leadership that does not suffice. There's no excuse for that.
Is there something that leadership could have done? You mentioned the 10-year ago time frame, NATO, the expansion of NATO, the Partnership for Peace. Is there something leadership could have done years ago and that leadership should do in the future to avoid situations like this one? And then we'll open it up to the audience. Chancellor Schmidt.
To me?
Yes.
I don't see much sense in talking about spilled milk. Whether,
Well, put it in a future context, I mean, to avoid future.
as regards the future, first come to the bridge and then cross it. You cannot, in the abstract, create leadership. You will have to bring people forward, elect them as members of parliament, try them out as parliamentary secretaries, later on as ministers in small portfolios, later on in important portfolios like finance or foreign affairs or defense even, and then you might elect them to become prime ministers or something. I'm not so sure whether the career of a political leader in this country, from a state governor to the supreme commander of the one and only superpower, as some Americans believe they are, whether this is a good type of a career. Some more foreign experience, foreign political experience, for instance. Some knowledge, where is the Balkans Peninsula? would be a good accompanying knowledge in the head of somebody who wants to become president. And not only where is the Balkans, but what has happened on the soil of the Balkans over the last 500 years. What did happen when the Balkans were divided between the Austrian double monarchy in the north and the Ottoman Empire in the south, and what happened when the Ottoman Empire weakened, and who did what. Would they know that the Polish once saved the city of Vienna, which was beleaguered by the
Europe,
Turks?
not only city of
Pardon?
Vienna. Europe.
She said Europe. She said
Not just
Europe, not
Vienna.
only Vienna.
I agree, madam. I agree. But my question is whether the former governor of some state in the United States ever has heard of this issue.
But you're really being critical of the American voters, the American electorate, because they chose a leader who did not have particular foreign policy, international experience.
I would say I have been coming to America some 75 or 100 times over the last 50 years.
100 years as well.
But when I came here first, 1950, and I was elected to Parliament in 53, and many times in the 50s and the 60s. At that time, as a European young politician, you needed, in order to understand what the American foreign policy was about, you needed just 2.5 days. You needed 1 day either in Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Johns Hopkins. You needed half a day in New York in the Council on Foreign Relations and listening to John McCloy, and 1 day in Washington, D.C. to talk to an undersecretary in the Treasury and the State Department. You had a homogeneous foreign political elite in this country. Nowadays, this is gone. And the quality of foreign politics has lowered due to the fact that this former East Coast foreign political elite has not been replaced by another elite of the same quality.
But Helmut, that might be true.
You mean it's too harsh? Not too
no.
nice.
It's too flattering for the school.
Goes over great at Harvard, you're okay, you're on safe ground here.
I think it's true, but there is something else which you're not saying. There are great and powerful countries in Europe. They've been trying to establish a union, but Britain, France, Germany, maybe Italy, and others, collectively as rich or richer than the United States. And I can't think of a single issue on which except for the unification of Europe itself, in which Europe has stood up on a world issue and tried to offer some sort of leadership. Not even in Yugoslavia. America has to do something. I mean, if Europe didn't want America to do anything, why didn't Europe tell America, no, we don't want you here? Europe can't just blame America when Europe itself, almost as a positive act, refuses to lead. I actually think that the extension of NATO was one of those negative acts of leadership, which will prove to be a major and fundamental disaster.
I can agree.
We have some European leaders here.
Yeah, of course.
We have some European leaders who want to
think all
respond.
of it, what you said, Malcolm, was correct. But then,
It was different when you were Chancellor. There was then new leadership.
but then, you know, if you judge the Europeans from an Australian viewpoint or American viewpoint, you must not forget that these right now 15 European nations, members of the European Union, have national histories behind themselves of 1,000 years, and some of them even 2,500 years, like Greece or Italy. They have their national language. They have their national traditions. They have different religions. It's the first time ever in the written history of mankind that nations voluntarily try to put their fate into one entity. It never has been done, neither in ancient China, nor in ancient Egypt, nor in what nowadays is Iran or Iraq, or under Alexander the Great, or under the Khans who came from Central Asia right into Central Europe. It has not been done under Stalin, under Hitler, under Napoleon. It's the first time ever that nations with a long history behind themselves try to unite. And it meets with enormous reluctance in all of these nations, and therefore it can be done only stepwise. I am on your side if you criticize the slow tempo in which it goes forward right now.
I don't mind that, the slow tempo of the European Union for its own unification. That's fair enough. But surely these great and powerful and ancient states with more wisdom than all the rest of us, because, you've had so much longer to be wise, spare a little time for other problems.
Okay. I want to disagree. I hesitate now because
With
I haven't...
which one?
With Malcolm. With Malcolm very much. But I'm maybe too young for him to say a few words. In the first place, it's not going slowly. If you see that we agreed in Maastricht on the single currency and achieved in 7 years since then, and you see this in a historical perspective, it's not going that slowly. Secondly, Europe not reality and not speaking up, not doing anything. Nonsense. If we talk trade issues, very important, the economy, the complaint is more about the European Union to be too strong, not to be too weak, and they speak up. And sometimes we have the quarrels with other countries, which is good, and we'll find a compromise. But there is a united Europe. Next example, security matters. Security matters. We voluntarily agreed with each other to go on with NATO. NATO is our instrument to achieve. You can do two things at the same time. You can do, we go on with NATO, which is a very important organization, and I find it was the good choice to do that, to protect Western values beyond the area of NATO itself, and at the very same time say, if we accept the leadership of the United States, no, for certain problems we want another leadership. That doesn't work. The instruments, the military, the capacity, military capability is of course with NATO. So NATO have to decide to go or not to go. So let's not confuse ourselves. This is not a question of weakness of Europe, it's a question of wisdom. People here would hate when the French would have organized a separate military organization in the European Union set apart from NATO. We have said this is not a good way. Third example.
What about Yugoslavia?
Yugoslavia is a good example.
No, but surely the problem is that I think Europe has done extraordinary. I toured the European Union in '88 and in anticipation in '92. I'm astonished at the political integration in Europe. It really is unprecedented. The problem with Europe and with NATO is that NATO's whole strategic plan was designed to protect Europe from a massive land invasion from the Soviet Union. The Cold War ended and everybody breathed a huge sigh of relief and said, hoo-ha, that danger's gone. And not understanding what would happen when the realpolitik of the Cold War was lifted from certain parts of Europe. And I think we're slow to respond because all of our reflexes are to deal with a problem that doesn't exist, and we now have a problem. And a few years ago in Italy, Helmut Schmidt spoke very eloquently of the absolute urgent need for our countries, Western countries, to understand Islam. We're still out to lunch. We still generalize, and yet here is a force that's growing. We're still stuck in the paradigm of the Cold War, and that's how we're so slow to respond. And I'm not surprised that Europe did not instantly have a strategic plan. First of all, there's all sorts of historical reasons. I can remember hearing Helmut Kohl, you should pardon the expression, talking in 1993 about how Germany would never send troops into Serbia. I was astonished when the Luftwaffe took part of this because, they're almost prisoners of history in some ways. So I think the real challenge is, how do we get wisdom in short order? We create certain situations. How do we recognize when there's been a fundamental paradigm shift and all the old ways of doing things are no longer applicable?
How do we?
But I was misunderstood. I was not talking about Europe within Europe and the European Union. That Europe has devoted attention to and has made some substantial decisions. But the rest of the world also exists. And where around the world people criticize the United States if they don't like America's leadership in this issue or that issue or some other issue, there are a number of issues of importance also to Europe, and Europe could try to show some sort of leadership for something that happens outside of Europe. There is, after all, a world outside of Europe. It does exist.
Yes, we know
I-
about it.
I want to give our other members.
I'm sorry.
President Bigness.
So listen to the discussion. Of course, we repeat some arguments and counter-arguments we did when we discussed enlargement of NATO since 10 years, and now enlargement of European Union. And of course, in the part of Europe I come from, we agreed for this kind of organization, that we are member of NATO with United States leadership in NATO. Of course, it's the only reason, and we argued, and also I argued as a prime minister that it's a guarantee for us to be in such an organization, such a military pact. And the problem of European Union is, of course, a different problem because it's a European organization, and now we are looking for the relationships between the countries, accession countries, European Union, and the other part of the world. Because we are not thinking only on Europe as such, but also looking for the new relationships with other countries. And we have the relationships. I think that maybe we are the best example, because Poland should create and develop relationships with such a countries that are not a member of European Union, and they will not be a member of European Union in near future, like Ukraine, Russia, and Romania, Bulgaria. We have very good relationships. So for us, Europe is not only European Union, but it's a Europe with the whole traditions, culture, and roots, European roots, we fully recognize at the moment at the end of 20th century.
Questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones. Step right up and give us your name, if you would.
I'm Turkel Peterson. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. I have to say that it sounds very nice when you speak about these things, but I hear questions, and few answers. It seems to me as if there perhaps is a lack of the epistemological level here. Why are we not able to grasp these conflicts, these issues that are out there? It is, as some of you have indicated, because we're in a transformation. It's very immodest actually of me perhaps to say, but we are a few students here who have tried to bring some of these issues in here. But what we see is that the individual person is stuck with a piece of paper he has to write for the next lesson. These long visions, as Helmut Schmidt is talking about, overpopulation, global heating, seem so remote that most people here dare not touch the thing that might be relevant, a process.
What do you mean by people here? What do you mean?
Many students here and many faculty are stuck with problems that are bringing out an article for the next 3 months, ensuring in the competition with other professors that they write the next book before their colleague does. But when you look to the issues that we have to look at in my generation, it questions that are 30, 50 years ahead. And what I'm trying to say is, are your group, able to take the challenge of creating a forum where both leaders and the population of this world can participate? We have suggested this several times, but we have big problems coming through with it.
When you say we, you mean your generation is
People here concretely at this school have done that. It is very, very difficult to get through with it. But I hear so many political leaders saying, we would like to hear answers. We're trying to offer it. Please take it.
Some of our panelists have talked about the age discrepancy and how the young generation coming along has ideas and aspirations that perhaps the generation of the leadership hasn't recognized. But, I mean, in answer to his question, I'll come back to you because I think you were the one who raised that, Kim Campbell.
Well, I mean, it's a difficult comment to respond to. Political leaders make decisions in short term, but they are supported by a whole infrastructure of public servants, of links to scholarly institutions, of trying to get the best access to information, to digest it and develop policy. When policy can be developed over a period of time, there is more opportunity for public debate. But I think it's a responsibility of citizens to try and tackle these issues, to try and create informed discussion. And I think what's important to understand is that there aren't simple answers to any of these questions. And there are even disagreements among so-called experts. You know, Harry Truman's famous comment about wanting to have, a one-armed lawyer, because he was tired of people saying on the one hand, on the other hand. So there must be a young audience, because anybody over 30 would have heard that joke 1,000 times. But, I will just ramble trying to answer, because I think the short answer is it's appropriate for you to try to tackle those questions. Leaders seek wisdom by trying to get the very best information they can. But there are disagreements. There are realities of political force. And to mobilize your fellow citizens to be wise voters, I think is one of the most important things you can do as a citizen.
Yes, and tell us your name, please.
Good evening. My name is Ellie Lambert. I'm an undergrad at Harvard in biochemistry. And I would just like to thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight. It's been a real honor to hear you speak and have you share your thoughts with us. The question I have concerns the increasing role business, and particularly international, multinational corporations, are playing in government policy, and I'm wondering where you see this relationship going. For example, in America, it's well known that corporate lobby groups hold influence over public policy. In recent months, this whole kind of banana quota debate has sparked off diplomatic issues around the world. And for example, also this past fall in France, there were talks on the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, the MAI, which seemed to falter, but the intention of this conference was to create kind of a supranational agreement for corporations where they bypassed, in some senses, checks that governments could impose on the way they functioned. I find this very concerning, and I'm just wondering, this all speaks to the enormous power that multinational corporations are gaining. How do you see the balance of power evolving between government and business in the 21st century?
President Vigdis, you brought up some of this a moment ago, the capitalistic capital.
Well, I was on a different line a little bit. I would rather answer the young man who was over there. Because I think that politicians and political people do not talk enough to young people. I would like a dialogue between the politicians and young people. And I base this on the fact that I so often have heard young people say, well, they never listen to us. Why should I go and listen to him? And so I would like to see that. But I think that the gentlemen who have this long experience in both business and politics should answer this question that you are putting.
Okay.
Well, I would just like to say that although I come from a small country, we do have a very large international company business. We're in fact third behind London and New York, and one of the fifth richest countries in the world. And what we have is, first of all, understanding our relationship as government. It is our responsibility, I believe, to provide the environment in which business can flourish, because they provide the jobs for our people. At the same time, I think they have a responsibility to the public that they serve. And I want to say that I was very pleased while attending the World Economic Forum in Davos that they had on the agenda the social responsibility of business. Now, that was a major change. And the fact that these major corporations understood that they cannot continue to operate into the next century without first understanding that, and it is because, in fact, of the globalization of their companies, that they began to understand that, because they saw the impact when they moved their company to another country, the impact they have on the country, negative and positive. And they then were beginning to feel a sense of responsibility for doing something about that. In our country, what we have invited them to do is become part of a tripartite council who helps to create policies. They certainly do not run government, nor do they direct us, but we certainly take advantage of the expertise, the knowledge, and the skills that they have. And they do offer, for a small country, a very wide variety of skills that otherwise we would not have access to.
I think you asked a fundamental question which nobody is paying any attention to in a serious way, because there's been a substantial shift in power from national governments to globalized corporations. And I'm not talking about globalized corporations in the old sense, where Daimler-Benz might have a mirror image of Daimler-Benz Germany and half a dozen other countries. I'm talking about a totally integrated worldwide operation where they look to a worldwide market. And where once governments could have a policy which was designed to help get a fair share of the profits of an enterprise for labor, for example, now governments can no longer have such a policy because there's going to be another country with an educated labor force where they are paid less. So governments now have to have a policy to make sure that their wages are lower than in other possible competitive countries. Governments have to cooperate to make their countries an acceptable environment for international globalized corporations. And that has changed the nature and objective of government policy, especially in relation to labor union matters, in substantial ways. We used to have trade practice legislation. America still does, but I don't know how it works here. But in small countries, it really can't work anymore because it'll be counter to the interests of getting a global corporation to invest in your country. A world trade practices organization, nobody's even begun to think of it. So you've raised substantial problems, and in my view, nobody is yet trying to think of the answers.
Next question. Tell us your name, please.
Yes, I'm Ellen Roy. I'm a graduate of this school, and I wanted to offer a few observations and ask a question. First of all, democracy is a deliberative process, so although we talk about the need for rapid change, it seems to me that the nature of the beast is to be deliberate and to reach consensus in the center, and that is the rock that which democracy is based on, so that we have unrealistic expectations to imagine we can effect change through political process overnight if you want a democracy to be maintained. One observation. The second observation that you've all offered is, to some degree, the pace of change, population control, the magnitude of the problems that we face may need a more quick solution than we can perhaps offer through the old channels of democracy. And it was hinted at earlier that maybe there are other solutions out there, such as public-private partnerships, other than elected process, other than state-to-state negotiations, that may be important in solving our pressing problems. And so I would be interested in your thoughts on what might those new institutions look like, and what might those new
That are
scenes
not
or
solely
stages
government.
that are not solely government or
Okay.
are part of government. Do you think that is going to be crucial to solving our world problems?
Who wants to tackle this?
Well,
Short answers, yes.
Yeah. Mr. Lubers, he's
I-
so you should.
So but only briefly, I think there's some truth in what you say. I do think we're going to have to talk about global fair trading legislation of some kind, a global institution, because national institutions can no longer operate. We've created a world in which most countries are not going to be able to have their own banks, they're not going to have any corporations, they're just going to be branches of something out of a major country. Small countries without any banks, without any corporate bodies which are owned by its own people, they're going to lose something very substantial. Already have lost a lot. We haven't thought of how to make up the gap yet.
Very shortly, I think in the architecture you're asking for, of course, intergovernmental organizations for nations together will be more important than in the past. It's clear. Secondly, next to that, I'm convinced that non-governmental organizations are becoming more important, and we see it in practice. Malcolm Fraser and the students spoke about large global companies. What I observe is that large global companies have started to integrate in their mission statements societal values, not because they are so nice, but because they are scared for the public, and more in particular for a non-profit, non-governmental organization. And I think that's good. That's an additional instrument to defend quality of life. So if you ask about trends in the architecture, better coordination between nations, intergovernmental organization, and add to that the power of non-governmental organizations, and I will mean with power that they utilize everything. The shame factor, People don't like to be ashamed of their own company. The power of the consumer, the power to block new investments. Everything is important, and even the judges are important. We have to start to penalize companies there where they do not observe global values which are coming more and more clear. And then we can avoid the situation the young lady was describing, that we are going to a world only based on the economy and the market, but that there are countervailing powers. And by the way, if you allow me to say so, Madam Chair, there I see a very important role for women in particular, because they are very sensitive for those values.
I'll second
they
that.
know about, and they can invest in that. Thank you.
All right, we've been given a 5-minute reprieve by Dean Nye, so we can take another question, but I would urge you, maybe we can even get in 2 if you make it a short question. I hate to do this to you, but who's next over here?
My name is El-Sid Sherouzi, former exchange scholar to Krakow University. Let me pose the question to Premier of the Poland. I say to her, Dzień dobry, bardzo dziękuję. I want to ask you on national scale, how would be evolved a state of the affair between church and the state in Poland, given the historical significance of the religion in Poland, namely Catholicism? And the second question, what the Poland government has done so far to deal with the pollution in Krakow, in Nowa Huta steelworks, because we are talking about the very integration of the Europe. I want to see what is your solution for the 21st century of the Poland with regard to the wall of the separation between the state and the church, and dealing with the widespread, large-scale pollution in Poland, in Poznan, in Nowa Huta.
And we're going to have to do it in 3 minutes.
Yes, so it's really very difficult in 2 minutes to describe the relationships between church and government in Poland, yes, because it's the 1,000 years history, and I think that even in the last 5 years, it was a very important problem. But I think that we were able to establish relationships between church and Poland on a very good ground. I can say it's a kind of friendly relationships and kind of cohabitation between 2 institutions. We ratified agreement between Holy See and Poland, but at the same time, Polish Parliament passed law concerning the relationships between state, between government and other religions. And at the moment, we have international treaty, concordat, between Polish government and Holy See, but at the same time, we have, at the moment, I don't know, 9 or 11 laws concerning the relationships between individual other churches and Polish government, because the main basis and general principles is tolerance in our country. So for that reason, even being a majority, having a majority of Catholics in our country, we guarantee the full rights to other minorities churches, and for that reason the other laws are so important. And what concerns pollution, I think that first of all we have to pray, yes, to find money for the
Churches back in town.
There's our solution for the 21st century. I think maybe it's got to, if it's short, we have time for one more, and I mean short.
Well, it's at least philosophical. My name is Vigen Sargsyan, and I'm from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. These days I wear a different sweatshirt. I wear the Fletcher School of War and Strategy. As a person for whom law and diplomacy are a professional field, it's very hard today to watch the processes, and it was terribly difficult to see Secretary General of UN not knowing how to answer the questions about bombings of Iraq, not knowing today how to answer the questions about bombing of Kosovo. United Nations is living the worst crisis after the Cold War. What is the leadership for 21st century in the international scene? Where are we going in this direction? And who are the leaders who are going to take the initiative for this century? I know this is a very long
No.
question for closing, but, well.
The answers are long ones, but it's an important question. Who would like to?
Well, if I may say that I do not think that the world would become worse if we had more women in governance.
Is it true we would have fewer wars if more women were?
I'm convinced that women would most certainly try to find a way before they accepted a war.
Can I just address it? Because I think that the question whether there would be more war, peace with more women, I don't think that's really the issue, although my instinct agrees with Vigdis. But I think the most important issue, we've talked tonight about the problems facing the world, and even experienced political leaders have no easy answers because the field keeps shifting as you're trying to get a sense of it. And what that means is that the world needs all of the talent and wisdom and creative ability that reposes in the human race. And that means that half, that are more than half, that are women, have got to be prepared, have got to be freed to make their contribution. Men have done many wonderful things in this world, but the problems are so great we cannot define out of participation any group so large as women. And so whatever truth, beauty, and justice they bring to the process will be theirs, but the world needs all that it can get, and that's why women need to be equal.
And I cannot think of a better note upon which to end. Let's thank all of our participants, Prime Minister Campbell, President Finnbogadottir, Prime Minister Fraser, Chancellor Schmidt. You haven't gone to sleep. I know you're listening. Prime Minister Lubers, Premier Smith, and Prime Minister Suhotka. Thank you all very much. I saw you with your eyes closed, and I couldn't resist. We could have talked for 3 hours.